My name is Calvis Rice, and I'm the Director of Global Business Development at IPS. And today I'm going to be talking about battling retirement in the can industry. I want to start by telling you a bit about myself as a can maker. I started my first job in 2004 at the R&D facility at Ball Corporation in Broomfield, Colorado. And I was lucky enough to have my first boss also be my first mentor. And I really remember how passionate he was about cans and the engineering that went into making cans and the processes that went into making can lines efficient. He really was the first proud can maker that I ever knew. And as I went on to my next company, IPS, I continued to be fortunate enough to be surrounded by career can makers who allowed me to keep learning. And at some point I realized that I too was proud to be in the can industry. This was in large part because of the generation of can makers that came before me. This generation built entire careers in the can industry. They dedicated decades to the industry. And because of this generation of can makers, the can industry grew. It was because of their hard work. It was because of their loyalty to the industry. They were resourceful, and they were also innovative. And the can industry benefited greatly with this steady supply of qualified can makers in the workforce. And although we knew it would come someday, somehow it managed to sneak up on us. Retirement. Can makers began retiring. Now, there's two sides to the story. One is of success. The can industry greatly succeeded in developing and maintaining a highly qualified and skilled workforce. And to an entire generation of can makers, the can industry provided stable, good work. But there's also the other side of the story, which is failure. The can industry failed to make a plan for succession. They failed to develop a training program for the next generation of can makers. The ugly truth is that most can plants have training programs that consist of two main things. First, there is a collection of typically outdated and incomplete resources. But the main way that the can industry trains today is a new employee comes in and the manager says, "Hey, go follow Joe. Joe will teach you how to be a can maker." So we knew that we would have a big retirement at some point, and we started getting comfortable with how this might look. But then suddenly, a couple of years ago, the world started caring about plastics washing up on beaches and filling our oceans. And the consumer said enough is enough. And they demanded that the products they consume go to a more sustainable package. And that sustainable package is our industry. So the skilled resources have never been at a lower level, and the demand has never been at a higher level. And just then, COVID strikes. And COVID impacted plants in many different ways, from quarantines to limited staffing, and also giving can makers great challenges in moving resources from one plant to another. So this is the perfect storm, and we are right in the middle of it. The can industry today is defined by two main things. The first one is the demand. Can plants are sold out. They cannot make enough cans. And to meet that demand, they are building can plants at a pace never before seen. This should be great for the can industry. We should be standing up and cheering and wanting to hire, and let's go ahead and start building up our workforce again, and let's hire machine operators, and while we're at it, let's go ahead and hire startup specialists and life should be good. But we know this is not the reality of our situation, and our industry does not have these skilled resources. So what is the solution? What is the silver bullet that is going to get us out of the current situation? We believe there's two things that we should be focusing on. First is finally taking the first steps to training the next generation of can makers. And secondly, using external resources for plant startup needs. Gone are the days that we could take skilled can makers from one plant and leave them for months after a startup to make sure that the startup curve is nice and steep. The can plants need these skilled can makers. They're already short and they need to make more cans. So to start, if we're going to talk about training the next generation of can makers, we should ask ourselves, who are these can makers? First, we have millennials. Millennials are currently 25 to 40 years old, and they're the largest generation in the active workforce. Secondly, we have Gen Zers. Now, Gen Zers are 18 to 24 years old, and they go all the way back to 9 years old. So very soon, they will be the active generation, the largest generation in the active workforce. Now, they do have a lot of differences between these two generations, but there's a number of things that they have in common, and these are the ones that we should be focusing on as an industry. First off, they care about professional development. Gone are the days that we could simply hang a sign outside the door of a can plant and say, we're hiring, and floods of machine operators would come in. Prospective job seekers today want to care what's in it for them. They want professional development. They want to build their skill sets. They want to acquire knowledge because ultimately, they care about career growth. They want to know that there is a future beyond what they're doing today. And they want to do all of this using technology. Gen Zers were born into technology. They know nothing else. And millennials were used to using technology for so long that it is now second nature. It is no longer a nicety to use technology for these generations. It's a requirement. And finally, both of these generations care about social and environmental responsibility. They want to know that the industry they're working for is a good industry, and they want to know that their employers are good employers. Now, IPS has developed a department over the past few years called CanSCHOOL. And CanSCHOOL is focused on developing highly technical, engaging content for the can industry. CanSCHOOL has three types of people working for it. First, we have instructional designers. These are people that went to school, formally learned how to develop curriculum and how to create highly effective training content. Secondly, we have mechanical engineers. The mechanical engineers allow the team to truly understand the mechanics behind these high-speed machines that we're teaching about. And finally, we have animation specialists. And the animation specialists are who bring these pieces of equipment to life and create highly effective animations. Now, when we go into developing training content for a new piece of equipment, we always pair our team at CanSCHOOL with a very experienced subject matter expert, can makers that have worked in the industry for decades and have lots of knowledge to teach the next generation. And by combining these two, the technical content creators with old school can makers, we're able to create content that is modern, high-tech, but very accurate. And there's three types of training content that CanSCHOOL produces. First off, there is e-learning. E-learning is how the world is currently learning and how the world will continue to learn. It is self-paced, it is mobile, and it can be very effective in the learning path of new employees. Secondly, we can create classroom training. So these are PowerPoints that are used in instructor-led training situations. And so with a learning path, we start with the foundational knowledge. This can be either e-learning or classroom training. Once the foundational knowledge is learned, we move to on-the-job training. And the two types of content we produce here allow Joe, who is training the new employees, to be consistent in what he is training. So the content for on-the-job training is 1, written SOPs, standard operating procedures, to make sure that a series of events happens every single time a procedure is performed. And 2, it is an on-the-job training checklist. So when the manager now says, hey Joe, train this new employee, that experience is always the same for every new employee. Now, to re-emphasize the point, training the old way was a lot of photos, and it may have included diagrams. This is a perfect example of a diagram. This is a trimmer, and using technology of the time, this was an excellent way to represent how a trimmer functioned. But that's the old way. Training using technology can be very, very different than the old way. There's 2 things I want to show you. The first is animations. And the animation technique for training can be highly engaging, and it is easy to hide parts. It is easy to slow things down. It is easy to understand what is happening behind the scenes. So animation is a great tool that we use at CanSCHOOL. But it's not the only technique that we use. Another very effective technique is slow motion video. This is also the inside of a trimmer, and by slowing things down, we also see what's happening inside of a trimmer. The point is that we, as an industry, need to start using technology to train our next generations, and that is exactly what CanSCHOOL does. The content that CanSCHOOL produces is really dual purpose. First, it serves the can maker, the can manufacturer, because it trains the next generation of can makers and allows us to output more production and make as many quality cans as possible. But secondly, it can be used as a recruiting tool, because as we already learned, the next generation of can makers cares about professional development, what skills they will learn and what knowledge they will acquire to grow their careers. And of course, CanSCHOOL content is always focused on using the most modern technology. Now, here is the ugly truth. Training content takes time to build. If it was a snap of a finger, every single can maker out there would have a comprehensive training program for their can plants. But this is simply not the case. So we have 2 options. First, we can stick our heads in the sand and pretend that this problem will go away. Or we can think about where we want our training programs to be 2-3 years down the line and take the first step. So then there is the immediate need, which is new can plants being started up every single day. And the fact that we cannot pull our experienced can makers from other plants to support these new startups. This is where IPS can help. Over the past 10 years, IPS has been very active recruiting on a global basis. We work with semi-retired can makers and can makers with lots of experience, and we can provide all of the major skill sets for can plants on project-based situations. So things like post-startups, IPS is providing can makers post-startup teams to help supplement their current resources and make sure that their new can plants start up as efficiently as possible. Finally, I want to share a story with you that is very important to me, but should also be important to every can maker watching this and our industry as a whole. This is the story of plastics. Back in 1990, the plastics industry lobbied to get the recycle symbol put on every piece of plastic produced. And the plastics industry benefited from this greatly. For decades, the world thought that plastics were recyclable. It was the sustainable option. It was the green option. Until finally, information spread and technology was used by the younger generations to share information on social media, and photos started appearing of landfills filled with plastic, and oceans choked with plastic, and beaches filled with plastic that was washed up. And although plastics could technically be recycled, it was not. And finally, the consumer said, enough is enough. We want to go to a more sustainable option. And we, our industry, the can industry, is the more sustainable option. And the truth is, we have a product that can be recycled infinitely. It can be recycled forever, but that requires the cans to actually make it to the recycling facility. And today, for every chunk of cans that is recycled, there is a sizable chunk that ends up in trash cans and in our landfills. Now, we as an industry have two options. We can bury our heads in the sand and pretend that this is not the case, or we can make an active approach to fix this problem, because if we do not, our industry will suffer the same fate as plastics. And even if we, the can makers of today, pretend that this is not going to be the case, the next generation, they're smart. And not only will they decide to move their consumer habits from our industry to somewhere else, but they will not want to work in our industry. I am a proud can maker, and I care about building our industry so that the next generation can also experience what it is to be a proud can maker. If you have any questions about any of our training or service offerings, please contact IPS at the information presented here.